resolutions, I'd suggest that a deadline is set of, say, 6 weeks from today, and that the chairman and vice chairman are party to those further negotiations.
It seems a very reasonable and pragmatic suggestion, but I would point out that this committee, unlike other committees, does have a slightly different setup, and we are more inclusive, so it would also be the political group spokespersons, because we don't run this committee quite the same way as the other. So I would want to be inclusive, include Councillor Powell and Councillor Bolton in any such discussions, unless they have objections to being included. Of course, they can always opt out, but I don't imagine they would want to. I don't think that would cause any great grief. That's how we've normally. Very brief.
I understand what you're saying, Mr. Jarman, but I think this is such a major application. This has got such major implications, and I think for the sake of transparency, we should bring it back to this committee. We should bring the Section 106. It shouldn't, in my view, it should not be a delegated decision. So I'm going to maintain that position. Thank you.
All I would say to that is we have often done this with many things, and it is assumed, and the reason I wanted to be as inclusive is that the group spokespersons, chairman and vice chairman of this committee, unlike some committees in this council, past and present, will be responsible for and will be consulting all the members and substitutes of this committee. So that would be an inclusive process if that happened. It would not be me or the officers in a locked room making a private decision. So just for clarity, so people know what we're actually discussing. I'll now go on to Councillor Bolton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And looking holistically at this application and all the applications on the Sutton Road, as I was pleased to hear Mr. Jarman say that we were right to defer last time. We have moved. There has been an agreement, as we see in the urgent updates, and that's good. But, of course, what we've got to do as a committee now is not just obviously make a decision, but make the right decision as well, and that's very important. Bearing in, if I can ask Mr. Wright a direct question to start off with, which is, bearing in mind that despite this agreement, KCC maintain their objection to the application, how confident is KCC, should we refuse on the grounds suggested and it go to appeal, how confident are you that that appeal will go our way in that hypothetical scenario?
I would say very confident, given that we have a compelling evidence base to support our position.
Okay, that's interesting. And my second question, because, of course, I appreciate the work that's gone on by officers here, but obviously it comes to us as a planning committee, as members of the council, because we're, a point I often make, representatives of the community, of the public of Maidstone here. And the specific issue which is raised on this is the highways grants. And the highway solution, and actually to be precise, the highway solution proposed, whether that be the A274 mitigation or alternatives that other people think would be necessary. So perhaps I can address what I consider the elephant in the room with this application, which, to put it bluntly, is the Leeds Langley Relief Road. It's very uncomfortable for me, as a member of this committee, to be approving anything tonight which does not have a clear direction, shall we say, towards money towards the Leeds Langley Relief Road, because for many people that is the only way of achieving the mitigation that's required, and that the whole purpose of Section 106 agreements are for these applications, far more than traffic signalisation at Junction 7, because that will help address a lot of the issues that the Parish Council, that Councillor Newton spoke about, particularly with rat running down towards Willington Street through Downswood and also in towards town as well. So I'd quite like as well, before I move on to some other points, to have a direct answer to that question as well from perhaps both Maidstone Borough Council and Kent County Council officers on where the proposition that they brought back to this committee sort of fits with what I would certainly define from my perspective a desire for a Leeds Langley Relief Road, and where they feel that their proposal leaves us with regards to that specifically.
Well, I thought it was quite clear it left us a lot nearer than any. But I'll bring the officers in, but it seems to leave us a lot nearer to that possibility than it was before. But we shall see what the...
Yeah, I can only repeat what I have stated a number of times now. The local plan inspector on the Maidstone Borough Council local plan went through all the issues in terms of the KCC arguments that this particular part of the Sutton Road couldn't take any more traffic and there was no mitigation at all along the A274 which could improve it, and the argument that the Leeds Langley bypass would cure the problems. All I can keep repeating is the inspector found both of the sites in front of you to be acceptable, subject to the mitigation which the Section 106 is to secure, and did not include a Leeds Langley bypass in the local plan, mainly because of what you alluded to, Councillor Borton. There was no evidence in front of him.
Yes, I just wanted to know whether you were satisfied with that part of the answer.
I'll wait to hear what KCC say
fine.
first before addressing both answers.
Mr. Wright.
Thank you. The difficulty we've had to this point, I think, in terms of our respective positions has been we've strongly felt that a strategic intervention would be necessary to mitigate the impact on what is a congested part of the network. And we didn't feel that a localised approach to mitigation would be sufficient. What the mechanism within the 106 gives us is a window of opportunity to undertake feasibility and design work on that strategic intervention to enable us to demonstrate that it is the right way to go as far as mitigation is concerned. So, notwithstanding our overriding objections, it's a positive step in the sense that the two authorities have been able to agree that approach.
Just to go over, I don't want to go over the examination again, but I've been handed a copy of the inspector's final report, and I quote, this is what the inspector has said: even with sufficient funding, the County Council advised the examination that the earliest date at which such a road could be brought forward into use would be 2027. Okay. I'm not going to entertain much for further discussion on these particular points because it is fairly clear what position the inspector took. It's fairly clear where we are with the situation, but it is also clear that given that it was impossible to include the Leeds Langley bypass because of a lack of a specific route in the local plan as such, but there is a commitment to the review date, and there is a process here which slowly but surely, and I do want to see that slow and sure progress become slightly more rapid and sure progress, we have a mechanism that brings us far more closer in practical terms to actually getting funding for the Leeds Langley bypass than we've ever been before.
And practical steps are being made here, but, you know, we cannot ignore the fact that the inspector in his final report said that the mitigation already proposed was adequate. Now what we have is a process that if further opportunities arise and the strategic option becomes available, then those options can be taken. I mean, it's a fairly clear situation. Now, Councillor Mumford, I'm going to move on to you. Oh, sorry, you hadn't finished, Councillor Ball. My sincere apologies.
I do apologise, but I actually hadn't finished because I was awaiting the answer to those questions to inform what I was actually going to ask next. And I do promise this will be my final set of questions for the moment, Mr Chairman, which I'm sure you'll be pleased to hear.
I enjoy your question.
Well, I hope you enjoy this one too. Look, bearing in mind the response we've just given, and there's an element of truth in what everyone says just there. We've then got to look, and I'm looking specifically at the signed letter of this KCC Maidstone Council agreement here, and focusing very specifically on the A274 mitigation works, because, of course, that is what's seen as far more, or is what certain parties will think is far more likely to achieve the mitigation required to this development than a commitment to a relief road. So, bearing in mind all of that, what needs to take place between now, let's say for granting permission for this, in order for these deemed to be not acceptable to mitigate the risk of this development? What specifically needs to change from that point of view in order to explore the strategic option? That's my final question, Mr. Chairman.
Very interesting question it is too.
Yeah, if I could answer that, that's the point of the cascade. In my language, it's two hurdles. The first hurdle is for Maidstone Borough Council to be satisfied by evidence from Kent County Council that any of the improvements along the A274 cannot be delivered. So that's the first hurdle. If that can be demonstrated to our satisfaction, because we are the local planning authority, then the second hurdle is what you mentioned, Councillor Borton. Then the next hurdle is, and as I understand it, work is taking place now by Kent County Council to evidence that a Leeds-Langley bypass, for example, there may be other strategic options, is the best way forward for relieving congestion along the A274. So obviously, as the Chairman said, one of the things that's needed is a route, but obviously there'd need to be a choice of routes, there'd need to be cost-benefit analysis, there needs to be environmental studies to do with ancient woodland, ecology, I could go on. But a solid evidence base has to be put forward for this strategic option.
I think that's admirably clear. And we now move on to Councillor Mumford. Sorry? I thought it indicated he hadn't, but I'm quite happy to take it if he did. Mr. Wright?
Nothing to add other than to say, well, I mean, that was certainly the position of the local plan inquiry in the sense that we would undertake feasibility work on a Leeds-Langley relief road to inform the local plan review process. So this is very much in tune with that.
Okay, thank you very much. I was right. but thank you, Councillor Bolton, for some penetrating questions. Councillor Mumford, please.
Just check with Councillor Bolton. Is it all right? Carry on. Yeah. Cheers. Thank you. I'm very conscious that this was all discussed July 2016, and that will form part of the evidence at the appeal. where we looked at the local infrastructure. What we had at that time was two authorities, Maidstone Borough Council, just my opinion, and KCC at loggerheads. I've now got, after we decided to go forward, I've now got a letter, quite an adult letter from both organisations, signed by both, that says we're able to advise councillors they should feel content that congestion along the A274 should be relieved by local whatever. So now I've got the two authorities telling me I should be content and confident, but we already made that decision. And tonight we're looking at adjustments to the 106s. We're looking at Junction 7. It's quite limited what we're being asked for tonight. We're not being asked to open the debate again. But one area I would like to go down is Mr. Chapman's given his planning opinion on the community centre. That was not the question. I think what Councillor English asked was, what if we were of a mind to, could we do? What wriggle room is there? Now, the planners might have a lot of experience in planning. I've got a lot of experience in trying to bring two locations together, get community spirit, and get them to work as a community. And ultimately they're going to have a problem. They're going to have the same problem with me. You cannot expect to form a community in a community hall across a main road and in a completely different location. That's what I've got in Bourton. And I've gone 20 years trying to bring that together. It does not work. The only way they will get community and a community spirit is to bring the community together in their own hall. Now, that's what I'm looking for is not what we decided, it's what wriggle room have we got. If I look at all of the 106 contributions, I've got a contribution of £108,400 going to Seneca. Is there any wriggle room here or negotiations with the 106s across all the sites to provide a community centre so the Ottom can build a community? It's the only way they do it. What wriggle room have we got if we want to do it?
Thank you. I'll take a couple of more contributions before. I'll take Councillor Powell's contribution at least before coming back.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, mine's more of an observation because I know that the question that we're being asked this evening is how would we determine this particular kind of application as far as anything else. And I will come back to absolute basics. And picking up on some of the points that have been mentioned by members and indeed our speakers this evening, and there's been some excellent points been made. We're talking about the transport network. That's basically where KCC and Maidstone Council have been at loggerheads, and for the only time I think I've agreed with KCC. I think I've probably mentioned that at every single meeting. I also think that some of the questions that have been asked by KCC are almost saying to Maidstone Borough Council, OK, fine, if you think you can do it, prove it. That's the way that I understand that letter. I might be told that I'm completely wrong. And the reason why they're saying that is they don't believe that Maidstone can deliver. And that's the position that I'm in tonight. Do I believe that Maidstone can deliver on those or those questions that have been asked by KCC? Additionally, last year, back in July, I don't wish to go back on that because, as you well know, I voted against all of these particular developments. But the words, things like accidents and flooding, was actually brought out at that particular time. A few months later, we're told tonight that there's been 6 serious accidents and flooding. There's something that's got to be done about that. But it all comes back to transport again. And I'm often seen as being quite negative about some of our kind of planning decisions that on this council. But I feel very, very uncomfortable tonight about talking about Section 106 arrangements when we haven't actually kind of fully dealt with the initial problems. And I will just say it because it's on public record. I'm also very, very uncomfortable about money being spent on Junction 7 when that money should be spent for the need of the local residents in that particular area that are being affected.
I think members do need to realise that we actually did, that this only came back to committee because of the discussion around Section 106, and that's precisely why it is here. And, I know we feel strongly about the other issues, but actually it came back because of the Section 106 issues. And I take your point on the Junction 7, but that was wasn't a decision really that we or KCC made. It was due to the intervention of the Highways Agency, so at a very late day in the proceeding. So neither local authority is particularly responsible for that, but I do take your point. Councillor Clark.
Thank you, Chairman. I've got a question which is focused on what we are able to consider here. Essentially, this is the applicant has planning application. This is a way to give increased mitigation based on what's happened with Highways England coming forward. So this is there's sort of the delta between this and what the applicant actually has is actually quite limited. But looking at the urgent update this evening, we've got the changes with Junction 7, but we've also got this sort of collaboration between KCC and NBC, and we've got this cascading approach between the local mitigation onto highways or the strategic undertaking that KCC is looking for. And my question is around that side of this application tonight. What I really want to see is the Leeds Langley Relief Road, when it first went forward to the point of almost being undertaken. This is going back decades now. A lot of money was spent right up to the point at which you could have almost put a spade in the ground, and it never actually happened. My concern here, I feel that relief is needed in the south of Maidstone, but I'm worried a little bit here about the safeguarding of the funds for traffic mitigation. Because really, we could go down a path of comparing local mitigation with this strategic view, and we could use up all of our funds for traffic mitigation before we get anywhere. And I just want some officer viewpoint as to how do we really safeguard these funds, whichever way we go, whichever way that discussion goes, how can we safeguard those funds on actually bringing about mitigation rather than debating two potential proposals?
I can ask the officer to come in, but I think it's paragraph 6.
If I may, Chair. The mitigation for the A274 is, as Mr. Jarman puts, the first hurdle that needs to be cleared before one moves over to looking at the alternative strategic mitigation, i.e. the Leeds Langley Relief Road. But the second page of the joint letter, at the top of there, talks about a cap on feasibility and design work towards that strategic alternative. Construction costs are not capped because we don't know what they are at this point, but it's just to give a guide to members in the limited time that both authorities have had to come up with this joint protocol, that we have started to think about ensuring that appropriate amounts of money are safeguarded for those works. So I hope that goes as far enough to answer Councillor Clark's point.
you very much. Mr Jarman, very briefly.
Thank you, Chairman. A straightforward point in response to one of the points made earlier by Councillor Powell. I think he summed it up, actually. What would happen is if both outline applications were approved, both applications were approved, what would happen is when certain trigger points were hit, monies for improving the A274 come to Maidstone Borough Council as the collection authority, then they are transferred to Kent County Council because they're the highway authority and they're the ones who change traffic lights, etc. And what we are doing on this first hurdle is when KCC get the money, or before they get the money, they can come back and say, we can't actually improve the Wheatsheaf. We don't know how to improve the Wheatsheaf junction. We can't improve the Willington Street junction. We can't provide any bus prioritisation measures. So then that hurdle's jumped over. Then you're into the strategic option.
Thank you very much. Councillor Harwood.
Thank you, Chairman. When I came to this meeting, unlike the Chairman, I was feeling quite chipper. I now feel quite queasy with this debate, to be frank. I mean, I know I often get pilloried for being pro-development, but if I'd got my way about 7 years ago, we would have by now agreed a housing figure of 8,200 in line with the Kent Structure Plan figure, and we'd have a much stronger local plan than the one we've got coming close to adoption now. So I will take no kind of lessons on this issue. And I think the background of this is very instructive. I mean, this does not just go back to July 2016. It goes back to 2000 and before 2000 when this site was initially discussed and so on. We know we've had problems with another scheme from this applicant nearby, but it's a completely different design team. We had lots of pre-application meetings. It's chalk and cheese. This is a very high-quality scheme on essentially on an arable field site. I think we overcome the design issues. I think it's a little unfair to talk about some of these local facilities issues now because we didn't have that debate before, and actually the SIL regulations that now inform Section 106 have been tightened, and I think that this is a relatively small development actually in the great scheme of things, and it's very difficult to make any changes. If there is any change, I think it should not be to the amount of Section 106, it should be a discussion about where the allocated Section 106 goes. So if there can be a discussion between Seneca versus Ottom and so on, that there may be ways to overcome that issue, and therefore if something is moved, I think that is the way to give delegated powers to seek to achieve the best solution for the local community. I think that's very pragmatic. Back to the crux of the matter, which is this discussion about the transportation cash. I am very concerned about the fixation on motorway junctions. All traffic modelling shows that most traffic journeys are not to motorway junctions, they're to the supermarket, they're to the town centre. They are, which is why the whole basis of this Leeds-Langley discussion is built on sand, because the thousands and thousands of houses that will be built don't want to go to junction 8 of the M20. Where they want to go to is Maidstone Town Centre or wherever. So, I think that's a real difficulty for us. And that is my problem. I am very supportive of this scheme in terms of the scheme that's been drawn up, in terms of the evolution it's had. I now have in front of me, as an urgent update, a blank cheque. And it is a blank cheque. It's saying, there is this agreement, and actually, in terms of what we're agreeing for a Section 106, it could be anything. I've spent all my adult life fighting the development of the countryside, which would come with building a trunk road through Leeds, Langley, and opening it up to development where we won't have a blade of grass between the Sutton Road and Kingswood. I cannot support a Section 106 agreement that potentially gives money, no matter how tenuous, to to my mind, are totally unrelated. This is a small housing scheme, 250 odd units. It cannot be an enabling development, even if it is in research and development, for a major strategic enabling development to open up currently inaccessible countryside to development, which is what it is, nothing more, nothing less. So I am in a really, really difficult position. 3 weeks ago, I was in a position, well, less than that, I was in a position to support this application. With this urgent update, I cannot support it in the state that it currently is. And I think there are others who have been placed in a really difficult situation. So I will kind of reserve the kind of my right perhaps to come back later on when we get something on the table. But at the last meeting, I moved that we grant approval. I'm not going to move that we grant approval now because things have changed, and they've changed for the worse for potential development in South East Maidstone. So I also really feel sorry for the applicants. I mean, obviously, the residents, in a perfect world, we wouldn't have extra development and so on, but, we've got government figures, we've got a growing population, we've got to deliver it. This applicant thought they'd overcome all these hurdles in July of 2016 on what had evolved to be a really good scheme. We've now had all of this delay for over a year, and now we get a scheme where the goalposts have been moved, and a number of us are placed in an invidious position. I suggest that the appeal for non-determination with costs might well be very expensive for Maidstone Borough Council. Anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Councillor Spooner, then I intend to wrap this debate up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've listened very carefully to all the speakers this evening. I think the people from the Parish Council have done an excellent job. I've listened very carefully to what the other councillors have been saying. I must admit, as a new councillor, it's been quite a mission getting up to speed on all what's been going on these 6 sites. They are hugely controversial. I must admit I was quite seriously taken aback last month to see the disagreement between KCC and the Maidstone Borough about the highways issues. Quite shocked, really, because that should not happen, not with the biggest housing site in the whole local plan area. But I'm pleased to see the officers have got their heads together, but they only seem to have gone halfway. We seem to be being asked to make a decision almost in the dark. We're being told we'll have this cascade condition, and we just don't know what that could involve at the end of the day. If a problem arises, now what happens if it cannot be ameliorated, if it cannot be treated? The people of Maidstone are going to have this terrific congestion along the A274, and we just don't know at the end of the day what's going to happen. Perhaps I've got that wrong, but that is my understanding. There's been a lot of emphasis on the A274. What about all the little lanes that people will use for rat runs? Perhaps this has been considered before my time here, but it's something that does concern me. The traffic on Ottom Lane, on Spot Lane, on Church Lane, perhaps it's been considered before, and I haven't been around when that's been happened. It's interesting what Mr. Johnman was saying about the inspector's report on the local plan, which I have every respect for, but there is no sort of 3-9 whip between the inspectors. Another inspector, perhaps if this application does go to a non-determination appeal, the inspector determining that may have a different view to the appeal inspector. That does happen. And then finally, just to pick up what Councillor Monkford was saying, I see poor Ottom here being swamped by new housing. I find it quite incredible that 106 money is going to Seneca. Surely there must be some wriggle room there to bring money back into Ottom. I think that's probably all I need to say, but I feel very uneasy, like Councillor Harbert, I feel very uneasy about this whole proposal.
Members, I think we are making this very, very difficult. The deferral was particularly because allegedly there was a non-involvement, non-engagement of the highway officer department in this process. That engagement has taken place and is now taking place. I remind members that regardless of other issues, the inspector who has recently heard the Maidstone Borough Plan found the existing mitigation to be quite sufficient. What we have here is a cascade mechanism that if that does not happen, would allow an exploration of alternative process, but it is extremely likely that that mitigation will happen. But leaving that aside, there is a cascade process. If we simply ignore our own previous resolution to permit, and an inspector's report that the highway mitigation is adequate and acceptable in just a few weeks ago, we are laying ourselves open to a very, very uncomfortable and expensive experience. And on top of that, there is every chance that an inspectorate may decide, as they often do, to look at standard conditions, standard Section 106 arrangements, rather than the very hard work that's gone in here, including the hard work that members requested at the deferral. So we would be putting ourselves and Kent County Council and everyone else to a very great deal of trouble for what is about as most unwinnable situation I have ever seen. So really, members, I ask you to really consider carefully what some of you seem to be suggesting. I'm going to bring Mr Jarman and, if he wants to, Mr Bailey back in now, because I think there may have been one or two misunderstandings on exactly how this agreement works, potentially works.
Yeah, sorry, Mr Bailey can cover the other points, but I can't stress enough just how important the public examination of the local plan was. It's as if it's never happened. Kent County Council put forward VISM modelling saying basically the A274 was going to be gridlocked. We, rightly or wrongly, put forward our own detailed modelling, and basically the inspector agreed with Maidstone Borough Council. I can't change that. Also, as I quoted earlier, what was also put forward by Kent County Council was a Leeds-Langley bypass as a solution, but I'm not going to repeat myself on that. But if we do go to public inquiry, as the chairman quite rightly said, in the run-up to the public inquiry, because it will be a public inquiry, probably co-joined with the site on the opposite side of the road, both housing companies will put in unilateral undertakings. And I strongly suspect there'll be no mention of a cascade agreement whatsoever by a government inspector. I really don't understand how a government inspector could disagree with an inspector's final report. Now, if Kent County Council or councillors have new modelling evidence, basically to prove that Mr Robert Mellor got it wrong, then that would change things. But I've heard a lot of opinions, but I've heard no evidence to back any of it up. And unfortunately, at public inquiries, like public examinations, it all goes down to evidence. Thank you.
Right. Councillor Harwood, you indicated brief.
I did. I just want to come back. I mean, procedurally, because of the very difficult position that some of us are in, I am concerned about a Section 106 blank cheque on transportation. There are some very sensitive issues in relation to impact on residents living on Sutton Road from some of the widening schemes that have been promoted. My main concern is inviting Hermitage Lane on steroids across the Leeds and Langley countryside. I mean, frankly, and you state, Mr Jarman, that an inspector at an inquiry that will not impose a cascade. And frankly, I am in the situation that I don't want a cascade. I want the simple mechanism to tackle the issues on the Sutton Road as was. I do not want these, as I say, these much scarier things that we could unlock, opening Pandora's box, through a vote that I make in this committee. So the natural development of the point you make is that I have to vote for refusal and to oppose this
no, you don't,
in order to not have that cascade effect, and in order that an inspector looks at it, looks at the local plan inspector's decision, looks at the evidence, and then brings back to the table what we were looking at a couple of weeks ago.
I would remind Councillor Harwood that we don't have necessarily yes-no votes in this committee. If he wants to move an alternative motion because nothing has been tabled, he has every right to do so, and we will test that democratically. So you do have that right, Councillor Harwood. We have not narrowed the options to a straight yes or no.
Thank you, Chairman. I've been quite silent during this debate, but I just wanted to come up on a couple of other matters that have been picked up and pick up that particular matter that Councillor Harwood's raised. I would just raise to members, and when you're considering this, you're considering what decision you would have made had you been in a position to determine the application. So what we are in is an appeal position here. So what will happen is, obviously, the Inspectorate will decide, as Mr Jarman has said, that it will probably be dealt with by a public inquiry. Mr Jarman has asked for full delegated authority to negotiate on the terms of the Section 106. So that's what we'll have to be doing, negotiating on the terms of the Section 106. So what's going to come forward is, you don't actually know what those terms of that Section 106 are going to be. We're going to be negotiating those terms as part of this, and that's what that agreement's about. And I would just draw you to the particular reference in the letter, because the way this letter is drafted, it puts MBC in the driving seat in terms of those negotiations. This is what's put into the rider on that. And I'll just pick up some particular words. And it particularly goes, prior to the commencement of MBC's local plan review hearings, if MBC considers, and it does put it actually reasonably in consultation with KCC and the JTB, that the highways mitigation could not be delivered so as to relieve to a material extent. So in terms of the wording of that rider, it's very much putting MBC in the driving seat of that negotiations. But I will just add, let's not forget, this is an appeal decision. So in terms of the decisions going forward, we will be negotiating with the appellants to sign a legal agreement moving forward, which is going to take some time in the future. I'd just like members to bear that in mind and take account of what the rider says. With regard to rat running issues that were raised, the issues in terms of rat running were considered in a lot of detail, and I would just advise members, let's not forget the Bicknor Farm application that was issued some time ago, which had the same riders in terms of rat running that were agreed, that were signed on that agreement. You've got the legal officer here who's been negotiating those riders, so the principle of that issue on mitigation has already been accepted by the issuing and the council of the Bicknor Farm decision and the signing of the 106. So the rat running mitigation has been accepted, and this will be carried forward into this scheme. Regarding the open space contribution, I think you've already got a contribution from the case officer on that. If members considered, again, let's remember this is a negotiation that's going forward as part of the Section 106, and you have, there is a request for full delegation to Mr Jarman. Those matters could be investigated, because obviously we'll have to do a seal compliance check, and we could do that and negotiate with the applicant moving forward to make sure that where the contributions are going, they're seal compliant. But quite rightly, you could put a request here tonight that officers investigate the redistribution of the open space monies to areas that might meet seal compliance testing. That is what would happen in the normal negotiations of this scheme. So I would just add here and stress again that all those matters with highway mitigation were accepted on the Bicknor Farm scheme, were previously accepted with this scheme, and nothing changes. What has changed and is substantial is the inspector has endorsed that. You've now got a final report that's been submitted, and he has endorsed those recommendations. So that is the big change from when you previously made your recommendation to approve this application.
Thank you. I think that's helpful. Right. I saw Councillor Clark indicate again, I think, and Councillor Mumford. I'm going to take those two responses, then we really should.
Chairman, I wanted to... my concern earlier was very much the sort of delta that was added here. And I am concerned about local traffic mitigation and the fact that we could potentially lose it because of the clarity between how we go about this cascade. But procedurally, I would like to really make a comment about the fact that this was deferred one cycle for MBC and KCC to come up with some form of a statement, which we have received. We got this at the beginning of this meeting. Yesterday, after hearing nothing, I asked if I could have a copy of it so I would have at least some chance to review what was going on and maybe make a few calls, test the waters, see what's going on in terms of some of the points that may be raised. We didn't get that opportunity. We got that opportunity when we came in here just ready to sit down and talk this application. So we're all, to some extent, acting on the fly and trying to work out where we are in a very public forum. And I really do feel that is not a good process in any way. I feel if this report was only going to be made available absolutely just in front. The response from MBC yesterday was, you will receive the report, it will be available when you get to the meeting. So there wasn't any opportunity to get that earlier today. And I just feel that if you've got a report that needs considering, you should have time to consider it and not do this discussion on the fly as we are doing this evening. That's my comment to this committee.
It's not as if the officers were sitting on it, Councillor Clark.
I absolutely agree. I absolutely agree, but I feel that given it took so long, I absolutely take that point. I'm not criticising officers for that. But given it came in so late and it wasn't going to be heard, or it wasn't going to be distributed, I feel that maybe that we needed to... I know we made the decision, but maybe we should have had a bullet point in this meeting just to consider the fact that the report had only just come in and where we go from here.
Right, Councillor Mumford.
Yeah, I think I'm in agreement with Councillor Clark and Councillor Harwood here. And small development and its money ending up being swamped by, what is it, a £60 million bill and just be swallowed up in the first consultants thing. But there is an alternative to this, and it's been on our papers. We haven't got a lot of wriggle room because of what the inspector said and what we decided in July 2016. So I'm really looking that probably what we could look at is the recommendations on the paper with the group spokesman's involvement, as been suggested, without the addition of the cascade part of it.
I think
so
that's
we can, and I
amendment.
think that will get some members with a problem. Another alternative.
Sorry, that's not an amendment. There's nothing's been proposed. Otherwise, that would be the motion. I'm assuming, because of your previous comment, that would be asking the officers to investigate, not increasing, as Councillor Harwood said, there's Section 106 for the community, but looking at whether or not some funds can be moved from, shall we say, less appropriate locations, such as Senacre, to actually be spent in Otham. Now, as that is in line with what you were saying, Councillor Harwood, are you prepared to second Councillor Mumford's motion? Thank you. I will now move to... I'll come back to that. Councillor Prendergast, you indicated earlier.
Well, what a mess. One of my pet hates when I'm sitting in this committee is listening to people talking about all the threats of legal challenges. I'm not an expert, but sitting here, I think the whole, we've heard Mr. Wright say that if this is going to appeal and there's a fair chance, they are confident, KCC, that there's a strong chance that that was my understanding. Okay, let's bypass that. What is worrying me now is, okay, it's a grey area about, the threat of legal action on the inspector's report or the emerging local plan because no decision has been made. What's worrying me now is if this local plan is adopted and everything is so woolly on it based on what the Highways Authority are saying, we are leaving ourselves wide open, in my view, for all sorts of people to come along. And I think this is dangerous territory. I don't know what's going on anymore.
All due respect, Councillor Prendergast, I don't know what you're talking about. I really don't. The inspector's been very clear on this. The Highway Authority, in his view, he may be wrong, but the inspector's been very clear, so we should know what's going on at least, because he's been very clear what his view is. Now, what we tried to do last time, because members wanted to, was engage with the Highway Authority. We have engaged with the Highway Authority. There is a protocol that's been reached. It's controversial. Some members don't like it, and they have the right to revert to the original view. That is their right. But it actually seems a very clear situation to me, and it couldn't be much clearer. Councillor Bolton, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was going to move a recommendation before Councillor Mumford beat me to it. And my recommendation was to grant permission because I feel that we have to, based on the inspector's reports and the fact that we actually did so last year. Unfortunately, because some of us have always maintained concerns about this. So my recommendation was to grant appeal. However, it was also to remove the cascade mechanism, but the other bits of the cascade mechanism to what Councillor Mumford said, which is basically, as Mr. Jarman explained in response to my question earlier, if I find the page, it was that the first stage of the process in order how this would work would be that Maidstone would need to be shown by Kent that the A274 highways mitigation measures could not be worked. Well, my proposal would have been to scrap that layer entirely and just move on to the second phase. So the Section 106 went straight towards the strategic solution, as has been spoken about already. So I won't be supporting Councillor Mumford's motion as is on the table because I was going to put forward an alternative myself.
I'm going to ask the office to come in, but I think if we scrap that clause, we would essentially surrender complete control of our local plan to the county council, and it wouldn't be an agreement anymore. It would be a declaration of unilateral surrender. But Mr. John.
Yeah, I wasn't going to use that language, Chairman, but basically we'd be in an extremely strange position whereby basically we'd be saying, as the local planning authority, we didn't want to improve the A274, even though the inspectors told us to, and developers are offering us money to improve it. And we'd be jumping on to a scheme that doesn't exist.
I see where you're coming from, Councillor Bolton, but it would leave us in an extraordinary position.
Previous decision we've already made.
Can I... Okay, in that, I've got one more thing, Mr. Chairman. That's I'd like to move that we have a named vote on Councillor Mumford's motion, and I'll move that now.
I would say a named vote is a very inappropriate thing to do in a planning committee where you are supposed to apply a quasi-judicial independent judgment of the cases. It comes very close to putting undue pressure on members to do certain things. And anyone can see how people are voting, but the fact of the matter is, I would ask you to reconsider because this is an inappropriate mechanism for a planning or a licensing committee by any standard.
I would, on the basis that this committee has used name vote before, and not least on the Woodcut
And in
farm
my view, it
application.
should not have done.
Well, in my view, it should have done, and that's why I will continue to propose a named vote. I know my view, Mr Chairman, on named votes anyway. So.
I take your point, Councillor Bolton, and when we're sitting in, shall we say, a more political venue, a capital P, and I hope we're not being political tonight and are looking at the planning merits, I'm sure we are. Yes, it's often an appropriate mechanism, but I really don't, not for licensing or planning. It really is immoral. It's immoral. I'm not happy. Mr. Jarman.
So, apologies for keep coming back, and this was pointed out in July 2016, but perhaps more importantly, at the examination. I'm also conscious that if some councillors don't want to see the A274 improved, why is LEP money, local economic partnership money, quite a substantial amount actually, going towards improving the A274? I'm thinking of the southern part of Willingdon Street. If, you know, because it is public money, quite substantial amounts of public money, but as I understand it, councillors, well, some councillors don't want to see the A274 improved. And I did make that point at the examination to the inspector, and the inspector found it strange.
I don't think that was what Councillor Bolton was saying. I think he does want to see. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think he was trying to be helpful and move the debate forward. It's just that it would put us in a very difficult legal position in practical terms if we did that. I'll give you some time whether you want to make a second motion or an amendment, if you like. I'll give you a couple of minutes to think about that.
No, look, I actually never moved it. I was going to say I was going to move it, but Councillor Mumford got there first. So I'm happy that we vote on Councillor Mumford's motion. If Councillor Mumford's motion is defeated, then perhaps I'll look again. But just to let you know, Chairman, I think Councillor Prendergast and Councillor Mrs Stockel will support me on going for a named vote. So I think that's a free that we need.
It is, but I will want to put it on record that I believe this is an abusive process and an attempt to intimidate members into voting a certain way. But what is done is done.
Sorry, who are the people who are?
Could I just also add, I don't want to go over and repeat what Mr Jarman's already said, but what members have also have to take into account is the other sites that have already been permitted, that have already been constructed. There are significant contributions already in KCC's coffers that are contributing towards the A274 mitigation. The schemes that are coming forward add to those already contributing mitigation schemes. So it's building up the pot of the overall contribution to the A274. So that is quite an important consideration, because when you look at SP3 policy, which the local plan inspector has supported, SPC looks at these strategic south-east interventions, and that is what that plan shows. So when this application came before the committee previously, it was looked at a strategic objective to look at the contributions along the corridor and look at all those sites contributing towards the mitigation that's been set out. So they pool those contributions, and some of those, 3 of those sites, have already got contributions going to KCC. So they've already been clearly, and as set out in the policy that the local plan inspector has already approved, H17, in terms of the Bicknor Wood, sets out quite clearly what those schemes need to contribute to mitigate the impacts of its development. Mr Jarman has already said the issues about the Leeds Langley. I'm not going to report in terms of paragraph 168 of the inspector's report, because it very clearly, and Mr Jarman only quoted the 2027, but he's very clearly said it would be, in terms of Leeds Langley, it would be unlikely to be delivered in the local until very late in the planned period, and it would thus not mitigate the transport impacts of development that have already been permitted. By that, he's referring to those 3 schemes that have already been built and delivering way in excess of 1,300 units already. So in terms of, I just implore members to look at those issues, that these contributions towards the A274 are looked at in the round, and that was previously what was set out to members when this application came towards members previously, and they accepted that provision.
We had a proposal, when we had a motion put, and I've got to move to the vote before.
Mr. Bennett has said something that I'm absolutely disagreeing with. Okay? And I think I have the right to come back.
No.
There's still a letter from Barbara Cooper that says that they object.
Councillor Prendergast, you've said this 5 times in the meeting. We're quite clear where you stand on this. You don't have to keep coming back, and I didn't call you. Constitution in the Council, if we're going to be sticklers to the Constitution, a motion was duly proposed and seconded some time ago. I've actually been remiss in not moving to the vote much more quickly than I have. So I do need to move to the vote on that. So I'll check the recommendation.
Sorry, just to the recommendation, as I understand, is on the papers with group persons' involvement in the Section 106, without the cascade mechanism to the strategic mitigation, and moving and the potential, or leaving the community funding open for negotiation.
Yeah.
Sorry.
We've already heard that it was. Those in favour of the... Yes, I'm going to come to that in a moment. Give me a second. I think members do need to be reminded that this is not a determination of an application, but a statement of what we would have done to the appeal. But thank you for the reminder. I think one thing we are clear on, I think, is that. So I'm going to ask our noble Democratic Services team to read out the committee members in turn. Obviously, the recommendation's been moved, and I was just about to say, sorry? Yes, unfortunately, much though I regret the attempt to, yes, well, we all know what this is about, but it is in line with the Constitution, and therefore, yes, there will be a named vote. I made that pretty clear.
I just want to quickly make sure that
the motion was to grant planning consent, to say that we would have granted planning approval on the basis of the recommendation on the papers, amended to take account of the provision to look at adjusting the Section 106 to allow for greater emphasis on the community facilities actually in autumn. And I think that was it. Yes, well, by definition, sorry, I was omitting it, but that sort of follows automatically. But I will add it for clarity, omitting the cascade effect.
Mr. Chairman, did you capture the fact that the political spokesmen will take part in the Section 106?
Yes, I will specifically include that, although I was including that in the definition of update. But yes, the details of the Section 106 agreement would be consulted on. The officers, as that negotiation goes on, would consult with the chairman, the vice chairman and all the political group spokespersons on the progress of that negotiation. And Mr Bailey wants to add something.
Just to be clear on that issue, obviously if that issue in the cascade is proposed by members to be not negotiated in the 106, obviously as the terms are set out, Section 10, KCC were proposed to be a party to this. So I just need to make sure if members are clear on that. When we're discussing these negotiations on the Section 106, it would just be between MBCs and the applicants. Just so members are clear, it would be negotiations between Maidstone Borough Council and Bellway as part of these discussions, just to be clear, Chair.
Yeah, that is. Thank you for the clarification.
That's to be in the recommendation.
Yes, I think you've got that. Right, I hope everyone's clear now. I can repeat. We can repeat if need be. Right, those names will now be read out, and we will see who will vote which way, either way. We start with, in alphabetical order, please.
If members could very clearly state for, against or abstain. Councillor Borton. Against. Councillor Clark. You're on there later on, don't worry. Councillor Cox. Councillor English. Councillor Harwood. Councillor Hemsley. Councillor Munford. Councillor Powell. Councillor Prendergast.
Against.
Councillor Butler.
Against.
Councillor Spooner. Councillor Mrs Stockel. Councillor Vizard.
Thank you very much. That motion is passed 7-6. Thank you very much, members. Right, I've proposed to take the tea break now as we approach it, and any members of the public or others who wish to leave at this point can take advantage of that. We will return at 25 past.